Chapter 1. The Ash Hauler's Memory. The cinder bucket weighed 40 gin. My arms said 50. I had been hauling slag since before sunrise, and the vast ember furnace yards had a way of counting every ounce of flesh they took. The yoke, the cinder dust, the furnace heat. I knew all of it, the way yard rats know such things, as the body's private arithmetic, tallied in silence and never spoken aloud. My shins knew the weight, and my knuckles knew it. The raw skin between my shoulder blades, where the yoke bit on every third step, knew it best of all. Then the flagstone came up and hit me, and the silence broke open. Heat arrived first, older than the wet, sulphurous heat of the yards. A furnace with no walls and no ceiling, and a fire at its center that had been burning longer than the sect had stood, and inside it, everything. 30 years of memory came down through my skull all at once. Not in sequence, in weight, the compressed sum of one life pressing through one narrow aperture, the aperture nearly cracking under the load. I remembered the smell of high-tier spirit stones, mineral cold against a palm. I remembered the grain of the 9th chapter's inscription ink, the way it had taken a month to dry because nothing in the yards could fix letters of that density into stone. I remembered the disciples I had trained, the ones I had selected and the ones I had set aside when efficiency required it, because cultivation demanded that cold economy, and I had never troubled myself to pretend otherwise. I remembered the morning of my execution. Cold air, the assembled sect behind the block. My sworn junior standing at the platform's edge, his robes catching the wind, his face closed in the way a man's face closes when the hardest decision is already behind him, and his silence when I asked the only question they permitted me: who authorized the decree? Ji-Lan had built his face on mine. I had shaped it across 20 years of teaching. I recognized every line of it as he watched me die without an answer. I was Mu Yan, the Cinder Sovereign. I had been put to the block 30 years past on charges of demonic cultivation. And I was alive.
Second furnace. Soul recondensation complete. Host body. Tan K. Age 11. Cultivation base. None. Dao insight. Intact.
The first thing I did was audit my limits. This body was small and underfed. Malnutrition had thinned the arms to sticks. The left knee held an old unset injury that ground cartilage every time the joint bent. The lungs caught at deep air and held it short. Ash lung, the yard hands called it. The furnace smoke's long tax paid over 2 years. The toll was already running. The meridians were the real problem. A cultivator's channels begin in every child as raw, untempered silk. The years of early practice that thicken them, that make them capable of bearing power, had never been given to this boy. Tan K was starting from the ground. I had spent 90 years building what Ji-Lan stole from me. Insight is not power. I understood this before the body finished announcing itself. The way an architect understands the distance between a blueprint and a foundation. The one can be perfect while the other does not yet exist. Every technique I possessed waited behind a wall the body would have to earn through, tier by tier. Force power through untempered meridians, and they rupture. A second death, this time with no furnace to catch the soul. I catalogued the gap. 90 years of technique, and a body that couldn't hold a cup of it yet. Someone kicked my foot. Up, yard rat. You're blocking the runoff channel. I stood. I would need to become very good at that. The furnace yards stretched north and east under a bruise of morning smoke. 40 iron furnaces still burning after the night's work. Cinder dust settling through purple air. The banners came through the haze before anything else did. Green and gold, flaring from every post and gate as far as the smoke would allow. A coiled jade vine over crossed furnace tongs. Hundreds of them. The same image repeated without rest down every road I could see. My sect's banner was a cinder wheel, black iron on a red field. That banner had not flown over these yards in 30 years. The breath went thin in this small chest. Ji-Lan's crest on my furnaces, his doctrine moving through my disciples, his name in the mouths of workers who had no idea whose hands had written the method they practiced every day. Mine, these same inadequate hands, reborn and bare, and wrapped around a balance pole I could barely lift. The thing that woke behind my ribs was old, and it was cold. A furnace properly built keeps its heat where you put it, contained and useful. What woke was the weight of a debt being written into a ledger I would have to carry until this body could settle it, which would not be soon. Jilan had taken my art, my sect, every year of the craft I had given my life to make, handed back to my own disciples as his gift, and they thanked him for it. I would take it back, but wanting was not a method. Wanting did not temper meridians, or move tears, or give years back to a body that was 11 years old and already ash-lunged. The accounting would open when I had the tools to open it, not before. The foreman came through the yard before I had finished the thought. He was a thick-necked outer disciple who had a habit of using his cultivation base to make silence, and he used it now, one clean pulse that drove 20 yard hands to their knees on the flagstones. He waited until the last of us was down. Centennial Rite in 35 days. Sect Master undergoes his ascension breakthrough. Inner, outer, guests from every allied sect between here and the southern reach watching. Double quotas from tonight. You fall sick in my yards, I'll know your name. You faint on the stones. Questions waste my time. Around me the yard hands bowed their heads. A few pressed their foreheads to the stone. There were stories about the sect master in the yards, how he had cracked open a brutal closed-door art and given away the doors, how before his reforms, the dross path was one man's private hoarding, and now it was bread for the hungry. The foreman saw the bowed heads and gave a small, satisfied nod. I kept my eyes level and counted. 35 days. A nascent soul breakthrough, announced in advance, with an audience from every allied sect between here and the southern reach. Jilan had always understood ceremony. I had taught him that, along with everything else, and I had apparently taught him better than I intended. My fingers found a piece of cinder in the ash below my knee, still warm from whichever furnace had made it. I closed my palm around it and let the heat work. When the foreman dismissed us, I rose, fitted the yoke across my aching shoulders, and found the first step of the familiar route. The bucket weighed the same 40 jin. The smoke was the same smoke. Only the man behind the boy's eyes was different, and that was the only resource I had that had not yet been taken. Jilan's coiled vine banners snapped in the furnace wind where my cinder wheel had flown. I picked up my bucket and walked into the smoke. The left knee ground on the first step, and the second. 35 days. The knee would be a problem after. Chapter 2. Knowledge is not power. The dormitory held 12 yard hands to a sleeping mat and an oil lamp the foreman extinguished at curfew. I waited until the snoring settled, until the lamp gave nothing but a thread of char smell, then sat up. Knowledge. That was what I had. 90 years of it, packed behind a dead man's eyes in a living boy's skull. Every meridian loop I had calibrated, every refinement ratio tested across decades of patient work. The 9-draw scripture opened in my memory like a door I had walked through 10,000 times. Draw ambient chi through the body's 12 primary meridians. Refine the waste stream into usable essence, then compress the product into the lower C. Repeat. Simple enough that I had taught outer disciples the first chapter in an afternoon. I settled into first position stance, back straight, hands loose in my lap. The ambient chi here was thin, since furnace smoke does not encourage spiritual density, but it was present. I reached for it, with the easy assurance of a man picking up his own tool. The meridians stopped me. No warning, no mounting resistance. They simply refused, the way green wood refuses a nail, with no build-up and no negotiation. The chi was there. The pathways that should carry it were there. Between the two stood a wall I had no word for, because I had never needed one. A sovereign does not encounter this wall. A sovereign has spent decades tempering those pathways until they carry chi the way bronze carries heat. A child's meridians have never been tempered at all. I pushed. The wall held. I pushed harder, the way I had forced through 100 cultivation bottlenecks across a lifetime, focused and patient, and certain of the shape of the thing. Something inside my chest gave a high, wrong scream that arrived in my back teeth before it arrived anywhere else. Then I was on my side on the sleeping mat with no memory of falling. My palms were on the floor. A sound was coming from somewhere in me, and the sound was not useful. The room had contracted to a single bright point and expanded back outward slowly. Ceiling timber, a cold lamp socket, 12 dark mounds of sleeping yard hands, none of them stirring. I pressed my fist to my mouth. The cough came anyway. Iron on my tongue, and beneath the iron something older, rank and chemical, like a refinement pot when the temperature tips past the useful range and impurity residue begins to cook out, instead of separating cleanly. I opened my palm in the dark. Black streaked. The blood caught what faint light came through the window slots and gave back nothing clean. I sat with it, let the pain do what it needed to do. The rule was the kind of thing I had written into primer texts without thinking. Each tier on the cultivation ladder is more than a larger number. It is a different material entirely. A meridian tempered to first-layer chi condensation carries what a first-layer meridian can carry. Force second-layer flux through it, and the question becomes tolerance, not willpower, the same as pipe gauge. I had tried to push a golden core's pressure through clay tubing that had never seen fire. The grinding ache in my chest was structural. A joint bent wrong, not a barrier pushed through. One more push and there would be nothing left to push with. No Tao insight survives a burst meridian, and the body can be killed permanently. I knew that now the way you know a thing only after it has pressed itself against your teeth. 90 years of knowledge, and I could not move chi through a boy's arm. I set that down carefully, the way you set down something you know will cost you a long time to pick back up. The yard hand on the mat beside me coughed in his sleep, a wet, pulling sound that caught and caught without releasing, like cloth tearing one thread at a time. He had been making that sound since before I woke up behind Tan K's eyes. Every second hand in the block made it by midsummer. The foreman called it ash lung, occupational hazard, the price of breathing cinder. My palm was still open. The black streak had dried. A test disciple had developed exactly this presentation over 18 months of unvented refinement, and I had built the 9th chapter around what I had seen. The slow darkening of what a bad cough brings up. The breath that shortens season by season, while the lungs feel merely tired, and the hands stay steady enough to work. The peculiar chemical bite to the blood that smells nothing like burst vessels, and everything like dross residue, precipitating from a medium that can no longer hold it. The art G-Land teaches, as the Verdant Sovereign's gift is my art. 8 of 9 chapters, the 8th ending at a natural resting point that would not announce its incompleteness to anyone who had never seen the whole. G-Land had been a careful student. He had copied well. Dross refinement accumulates backlash. That cost was built into the path from its first draft, because impurity stream does not vanish when refined. It condenses. It migrates. Without the 9th chapter's safeguard vent, it settles into the meridians the way ash settles in a cold furnace. Fine-grained, invisible, filling the passages over years until the draw is poor and the breath is short, and what comes up with a bad cough is the wrong color. Every outer disciple cultivating by G-Land's miracle. Every yard hand taught to refine the waste stream for contribution credit. Every intersect cultivator who had swallowed a dross-purified pill felt stronger for it, been grateful. All of them breathing in the backlash of an art with no exit. The Centennial Rite was 35 days out. When G-Land broke through to nascent soul, the surge would travel outward through everyone who had cultivated in the same spiritual current. If the accumulated taint in thousands of meridians had no vent when that surge hit, the backlash would not be gradual. It would answer the peak of the breakthrough, the way a furnace answers a bellows, all at once. The yard hand coughed again. Caught. Could not clear it. I had authored the 9th chapter for exactly this contingency, then held it back as leverage and safeguard and proof of authorship. The capstone no copy would ever contain. Without it, the 9 draw scripture stops being a gift. It is a furnace sealed shut, heat mounting, nowhere to vent. I closed my palm around the dried streak. The man who had framed me, executed me, and built his name on my bones was worse than a thief. He had handed a loaded furnace to 10,000 people and called it bread. Whether he understood what he had given them, I could not yet say. That the sect stood 35 days from the seal blowing, that I knew with the clarity of the man who designed the mechanism. My meridians ached, and my art was poisoning the people breathing it, and I had nothing to work with. I lay back down in the dark. Somewhere above, Geelon's coiled vine banners would be snapping in the furnace wind, the same wind filling everyone's lungs with what I had built and he had broken. I needed another way in. Chapter 3. The Crippled Keeper. The furnace yards did not change between night and day so much as shift which ugliness was visible. Daylight showed the work. Night, once I had failed to cultivate and lay bleeding black on my mat, showed the workers, who moved with the weight of having been there a long time, who, among all of them, never looked up at the coiled vine banners when they passed.
Day 6.
2 days of that bought me a name, Old Fang. He ran the night seal on Kiln Row 7, the oldest kiln bank still in use, a relic from before Lan rebuilt the outer yards. He walked with one leg dragging, the left hip ground down to whatever remained after 30 years on those tiles. 60 at least, maybe older. Furnace work 8 years from the edges inward. He had been here before the transition. The way he moved past the coiled vine banners said it. The practiced vacancy of a man who has decided not to see a thing and has held that decision long enough that it no longer costs him anything. Sect hands looked at the banners. Pride, or gratitude, or the performed shape of both. Old Fang looked at the kilns. Among all the yard hands I had studied, he was the only one who moved like that. I went to him.
Your right bellows arm is slipping,
I said. I had spent an hour on Kiln 7's smoke pattern. The variance was small but regular, same interval each cycle.
Pin or hinge, one of the two.
He did not turn around.
Yard rats aren't supposed to be on Kiln Row after second bell,
he said. His voice had the texture of old mortar, grained, compressed, not worn smooth.
I'm a new outer court candidate. Assignment starts next week.
A lie, but serviceable. I had not yet sat the furnace trial.
I was looking for the supply station.
2 rows north.
He checked the seal on the firebox.
You walked past it.
I noticed your smoke.
I said. That made him turn. He looked at me the way an experienced man looks at something he expects to be simple and finds is not. Recalibrating, though not yet suspicious. I held the look without moving. Tankei's body was 11 years old and thin-limbed, with ash lungs still rattling faintly when the kiln heat shifted the air.
The pin,
he said, after a breath.
Changes with humidity. I've been asking the keeper master for a replacement since spring.
He turned back to the firebox.
What do you actually want, boy?
I had not expected the directness. I moved to plainer ground.
The lower yards.
I said.
The dead section. Kiln rows 18 onward. I want to know about them.
His hands paused on the latch, just for a beat.
Nothing down there. Sealed off before the current sect master took the hall. Old equipment, bad groundwork.
He pulled the latch shut.
Stay clear of it.
Who sealed it?
Before your time.
The old sovereign?
I said.
The elder before the transition?
The silence after that ran longer. He set his maintenance tool down carefully, the way a man sets things down when he wants his hands free, and straightened as much as his hip allowed. Whatever had been in his face went somewhere flat and watchful.
Where did you hear that name?
He said. It landed flatter than a question.
Older hands talk.
A beat. The kiln ticking between us.
You don't look like you believe what they say.
I don't say anything about what the older hands say.
No,
I agreed.
that's what I noticed.
Another silence. The kiln breathed its slow heat between us. Above, on the tier walkway, a patrol passed, steps even and unhurried. Fang waited for the steps to fade. He was quiet long enough that I thought I had pushed past what he would give. He did not tell me to leave.
I'm not asking you to say anything about them.
I said.
I only want to know whether the seals in the lower yards are still active.
Why?
Because I want to enter the furnace trial.
Whatever he had been bracing for, it was not that. Something in his face loosened.
Trials open to any yard hand. Monthly. Inner court overseers preside. You refine whatever slag they put in front of you. Pass the threshold, and you get contribution standing. Enough of that, and they grade you outer disciple.
He paused, seemed to weigh something.
Outer disciples. They get maintenance grid papers. Grid runs under rows 18 through 22. A man with those papers, if he knew which direction to walk.
A brief shake of his head.
I'm not saying this.
You're not.
I agreed. Then he looked at me again, and it was a different look from everyone before it. This one had moved past the first recalibration, and past the careful stillness when I had named the old sovereign. He studied me the way a craftsman examines a flaw he cannot place, lingering on it, holding off on naming it. The kiln crackled. My chest rattled on the draw of hot, ashen air. 11 years old, untempered, half ruined in ways that showed.
How old are you?
He said.
11.
You don't talk like 11.
The yard ages people quickly.
He held that a moment. Then he picked up his maintenance tool and went back to the firebox. He offered nothing further and did not look at me again. But he did not tell me to leave, either. I waited 10 breaths, then turned and walked back toward the main row. I did not hurry. The trial calendar was posted outside the outer court refectory, next sitting in 7 days. 7 days to bring Tonkei's meridians as far along as they would go, which was not far. The channels were untempered, the lungs full of ash, and the left knee ground against itself on every descent from the tier walkways. There was nothing to hide, and no use trying. A half-broken yard child standing before inner court overseers. The 9-draw scripture did not care what the body looked like. It cared what the refiner understood. No one living understood it as I did. I stood at the calendar. The plan had the shape of fact. The trial was open entry. Fang had confirmed it. Outer disciple rank opened the maintenance grid. Fang had confirmed that too, in the careful way of a man who will not admit to having said something. The sealed private kiln in the dead lower yards had held 30 years of neglect. A seal keyed to its maker's soul would hold until that soul returned to test it. 30 years, and Fang had kept whatever he knew in careful silence. Whether he would keep this conversation the same way, a crippled 11-year-old asking about dead kilns and a dead man's name, was not something I could calculate. He had looked at me too long at the end. A man does not look that long at something he has already decided to forget. 29 days remained. The left knee ached in the cooler air, away from the kilns. The ash lung clicked twice on the inhale. I turned away from the calendar and started back toward the ash yards. Chapter 4. The Refiner's Mark. The morning of the trial, Old Fang was at his usual post outside Kiln 7, mending a section of heat shield with wire and patience. He did not look at me when I passed. He had not looked at me since that evening 7 days ago, which told me more than a stare would have. A man who has decided something does not watch the thing he has decided about. What he had decided was beyond reach. I filed it and kept walking. The trial was held in the demonstration kiln at the north end of the yard, a circular chamber built for exactly this purpose, with tiered viewing slots cut into the stone wall where the overseers could observe without breathing the fumes. 6 of them this morning, which was 2 more than Old Fang had mentioned. I counted twice. 12 yard workers had entered the morning roster. Most were hoping for contribution standing, a few extra ration tokens, maybe a cleaner kiln assignment. 2 looked young enough to actually want the outer disciple rank. 1 was a girl a few years older than Tan K's body, dark circles under her eyes, and a jaw that said she had been awake most of the night, for reasons that had nothing to do with nerves. I did not look at her twice. I had work to do. The rules were exactly what Old Fang had described. Open material tables along the wall, slag heaps and low-grade compounds, the kind any seasoned refiner would discard and throw back in the melt. 12 participants, 1 kiln station each, 90 minutes. Produce the highest grade output the material allowed. What the rules did not say, because the sect had forgotten it along with everything else that belonged to me. Slag was not a low-grade material. It was the highest density dross available, concentrating every impurity a normal cultivator threw away. To someone who had spent 90 years learning to squeeze essence from exactly that kind of waste, it was abundance. The problem was the hands doing the squeezing. I positioned the slag charge in the firing pan and extended Tan K's chi through the tongs. The available quantity was minimal. This body had been building circulation carefully, a thread at a time, since the near rupture 5 days ago. Less than 1/10 of what I would have used without thinking in my prior life. Precision, instead of force. The art I had written did not require power, it required accuracy. I ignited the dross flame. It came out wrong on the first pass. The overseers saw nothing amiss. To them it was a small, clean burn. The wrongness was internal. Tan K's meridians had never held this particular chi configuration before, and the body resisted with a fine trembling through the forearms and a clicking in the chest. The ash lung, the taint already in this body from years in the furnace yards. I was refining through a vessel that was itself partly clogged, pushing the work through channels that fought the current. I adjusted. Narrower channel, slower rotation, the impurity moving through a tighter coil. It would take twice as long. I had 90 minutes. Around me, the other participants worked. Most were producing type 1 slag pills, standard output, barely worth the material cost. The man 2 stations over was attempting type 2 and had already scorched his base compounds. The acrid smell cut through the general furnace reek. The girl with the dark circles worked with quick, efficient movements, producing something cleaner than the others, but her hands shook slightly, and she had not yet pushed past type 1. The slag reduced. The impurities separated, layer by layer, each one requiring its own coil path through the dross flame. Take what is thrown away, and find the shape that fits together. 40 minutes. 60. The clicking in my chest settled into something rhythmic, almost bearable. At 78 minutes, the pill formed. A small sphere of condensed essence, pale gold at the core and faintly luminous at the edges. Grade 5 output from material that should not have produced Grade 2. The overseers went quiet behind their viewing slots. One of them made a sound and stopped making it.
Refinement assessment. Grade 5 output from Type 4 slag. No precedent in trial records. Outer disciple promotion approved.
The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then one of the overseers said, in the flat voice of a man reporting something he would have to write down and did not want to. Outer disciple rank. Effective immediately. Maintenance grid papers for rows 18 through 22. Issued by afternoon. I set the pill on the assessment tile and stepped back from the kiln. What I failed to do, and did not think of until later, when it was already too late, was close off the dross flame properly. I could not have done it in any case. In my prior life, after 90 years of refinement, the dross flame had its own character, a pressure signature, a particular turbulence, the way it handled waste heat at the edge of the coil. Nothing visible, nothing a standard cultivation sense would register. But to a practitioner who knew dross refinement at its deepest levels, who had spent 30 years dissecting an art whose original author he had studied until he could close his eyes and reconstruct the method stroke by stroke, the impression left in the air of a cooling firing pan would name its maker the way a scar names an old wound. I had not thought about it because a dead man does not leave marks. I was not, entirely, a dead man anymore. The girl with the dark circles was at my elbow when I turned.
Grade 5.
She looked at the pill on the tile.
From Slag.
Flat accent, the kind worn down by years of swallowing words around a mouthful of ash grit.
You're not from the yards.
Kiln row 9.
Row 9 doesn't work. Grade 5 refiners.
She looked at me now instead of the pill.
Trial winners get paired, sealed rows, together, till you earn your own access.
A pause.
You're what I drew.
Then we should collect the papers and get acquainted with the grid.
My brother is dying.
The way she said it, a fact laid down before the first calculation, not something she expected to move me.
Ashlung. He's 9. Outer disciple rations come with medicinal access.
Her chin dropped a fraction.
Telling you now so you don't think it'll be a problem.
I looked at her. The ash lung in her brother would be the taint. Jilan's 8-chapter art, slowly filling a child's meridians with nowhere for the poison to go. The same taint clicking in my own borrowed chest right now. Every inhale.
Nodded.
I said. A beat. She made a small sound, not quite contempt, and turned for the papers. I followed. Rows 18 through 22. 16 tiers of cultivation between this body and the lower yard kiln. The taint clicking in my chest was nested in her brother's meridians too, since before the boy could speak. 22 days remained until the Centennial Rite. North Wing, Jilan's meditation chamber. Jilan sat in the lotus position on a raised dais, the slow revolution of his golden core drawing the ambient chi of the building into its orbit. His eyes snapped open. The rotation stuttered, just long enough for a thread of chi to catch wrong against his meridians before the core corrected. He sat with the disruption, tracing it back through the spiritual fabric of the sect toward the northern demonstration kiln, to the faint impression still dissipating in the air above a cooling firing pan. A dross flame, a specific one he would have recognized in his sleep, because understanding the source had seemed, 30 years ago, like the kind of thing a careful man would do. The empty hall absorbed what he said next.
Impossible.
Very quiet.
He's ash. I scattered him myself.
The green silk moved once in a draft from under the door, then was still. Chapter 5. What the Sovereign Hoarded. The maintenance papers came through before dawn. Rows 18 through 22. Dead section access. Outer disciple clearance. Effective immediately. I lay on the dormitory mat and read them once, folded them against my chest, and stared at the ceiling while the other yard hands breathed around me. Jilan had sensed the mark at the trial. I'd spent 60 years building the art, and 30 years dead, and knew the pressure signature the way a man knows the pitch of his own voice. What I'd left on that cooling firing pan had been a name. My name. Arriving in the middle of a golden core meditation like a word spoken in a sealed tomb. He'd traced it back, and found nothing he could act on yet. A faint dross signature from a demonstration kiln wasn't evidence, and a sect master didn't move without evidence. But he would look. He was already looking. 21 days. I was on my feet before the morning bell. Su Lin was waiting at the lower yard gate, trial papers in hand, hair wound up for work. She fell in beside me without a word when she saw the direction I was walking. 2 days of trial preparation had taught her that I moved toward specific ends.
The other trial victors are reporting to the East Refinement Halls,
she said, as we passed the East Hall's entrance.
I know.
Our names will be on a list.
Let them wait.
She held the lower gate while I ducked through. The dead yards smelled of cold ash and old iron. Below the working rows, the constant furnace heat vanished, replaced by something still and faintly sweet, the way a fire smells long after it's out. Banners hung in various states of decay, and the ones intact enough to read bore the coiled jade vine crest so clean and bright against the surrounding ruin that it sat in the eye like a bruise. I'd built these rows, 12 years of it, corridor by corridor, until I had a private refinement section far enough from the outer disciples' work that my experiments wouldn't disturb their meridian conditioning. 7 kilns. The 7th had been mine alone. The passage I'd used for years had partially collapsed, a support beam down across the old route, and we cut through an adjacent corridor instead, adding 10 minutes I hadn't budgeted. Sulin tracked my choices without comment. The certainty in my steps had nothing to do with the maintenance grid, and she'd noticed. Kiln 7 was smaller than memory had it. Iron-banded cedar door. Dry as kindling. A black ring handle I'd cast from reclaimed furnace slag. The seal was invisible, set 3 layers deep into the wood below the handle. You had to know to press your palm there. I pressed my palm there. Warmth climbed from the cedar upward through palm and wrist, quieter than fire heat, moving through the half-healed meridians of this body until it found the thing inside that was not Tan-K. The seal had one question, and the ash hauler had no answer to give a mechanism keyed to a sovereign soul. What answered was older than the body doing the pressing, and it answered without hesitation. The lock gave. My hand stayed on the door. Short, blunt-nailed fingers, faintly blue from slag work, pressed against cedar I'd laid myself before the boy, whose hand this was, had been born. The seal had no eyes. It had found me anyway, which meant the shape of that question still existed, and I had not been its only keeper.
How did you open that?
Sulin said.
Careful restoration of the original mechanism. Don't touch the frame.
Her breath shifted, the slight pause of someone deciding not to push. She stepped back and let me work. The cache was behind the main firing basin, under a pull stone I'd set at an angle that looked like settling but wasn't. The preservation formation had been running on residual pressure for 3 decades and was down to its last thread, but the cloth inside was still dry. I carried the bundle to the work ledge and unwrapped it. 9 spirit stones, low grade, each holding roughly 10 days of ambient chi cultivation, for a practitioner at the first tier of chi condensation. Used correctly, they could compress months of body tempering into weeks. A folded paper, the left edge water-stained but the text intact. 3 paragraphs in my own hand, notations from the 7th chapter of the 9 Dross scripture, the section I'd been refining in the months before I'd first caught Ji-Lan watching me too carefully. The 7th, not the crucial 9th. Still enough to prove the version Ji-Lan taught was a deliberate truncation rather than an accidental loss. The margins held a single annotation I had never acted on. A note on running the vent conduit facing inward. The door hung wrong. The mechanism reversed. And a pill, stoppered in a lacquered tube. Dark green, thumbnail-sized, its surface carrying the faint iridescent sheen of chi, refined past the point of being useful for anything gentle. A cinder venom terminus. I'd made it as an insurance measure, and then put it here, because keeping it close was the kind of choice that eventually answered its own question. Concentrated dross essence, packed dense enough to vent a tainted core in one pull. Used on a body, it ended things once, quickly, with no survivors. I set the tube down and looked at what I had. 9 stones, and whatever weeks they could compress into. A folded paper that proved a theft, useless until there was somewhere to bring it. The pill, which served a darker purpose than either. The whole of it fit in 2 hands.
Those stones,
Sulin said. She stopped, started again.
I talked to one of the older yard girls. She said something like that, used right, it can help with the lung sickness. The ash build, if it hasn't gone too far yet.
Don't.
Pei is 9 years old. He won't reach 10. You have 9 stones, and I am asking for 1.
9 stones between me and nothing. 1 stone to your brother is 1 stone missing at the moment it matters, and I don't yet know what the next 21 days will require. If I arrive at the rite short of what I need, everyone carrying tainted meridians dies at once, your brother among them, instead of just your brother. The arithmetic doesn't shift because the example has a face.
I began rewrapping the bundle.
He is not part of my equation.
The ash on the kiln floor hadn't moved in 30 years. No draft reached this far down. The silence was the silence of a place that had stopped happening long before either of us arrived. Sulin stepped back. She looked at me, past my face, at some quality she'd been watching since the trial, and had only now finished naming.
You sound just like the monster in the bedtime stories.
She said.
Exactly like him.
Chapter 6. The Verdant Sovereign. The walk back from the dead yards took longer than it should have. The cold ground had stiffened the knee, the cartilage grinding on each descent from the rubble-strewn access path. But that was not the reason. The reason was that I kept stopping and starting, and then stopping again, which was something I did not do. Mu Yan the Cinder Sovereign had not, in 90 years, stopped in the middle of a path because a yard girl said something true. Exactly like him. I knew the legend. Every furnace yard child knew it. The tyrant who locked the secrets in iron boxes and watched disciples die of ash lung before he would grant a second-tier cultivation manual to anyone below elder rank. In those stories, the monster wore my face. The stories were wrong in the particulars and right in the shape. I was not going to let a dying boy's sister manage me. I rewound the thought and found it unchanged on the third pass. On the fourth, I was still standing on the access path, and the moon had moved. The announcement reached outer disciple quarters before dawn. The Verdant Sovereign would tour the south yards by mid-morning. Any disciples with current contributions standing were to assemble at the second Kiln Row crossing for a formal address. Sulin was already awake when I came in, sitting cross-legged on the far side of the room we'd been assigned, not meditating, just awake with her hands in her lap. She did not look at me. I did not speak to her. We dressed and went to the crossing separately, 5 yards between us the whole walk. The crowd was larger than I expected. 3 rows of outer disciples, the trial victors at the front with our orange contribution sashes, and behind us the whole slate of registered yard hands who'd clawed themselves into any kind of standing over the last cycle. I counted 42 faces I recognized from the trial queue. At least a third had the faint gray cast under their eyes that meant the taint was already working. They didn't know what that gray was. They thought it was the honest weariness of people who worked hard. He arrived the way I remembered. He came quietly, and that was the first surprise. I had expected the Verdant Sovereign to make an entrance suited to a sect master touring his lands. Banners, a formation of disciples, the formal salute. What I got was a man in an unadorned green traveling robe, who walked through the outer edge of the crowd with a slight nod left and right, touching a shoulder here, a child's head there, and arrived at the front of the assembly as if he had simply grown there from the earth. Jilan. The face was older than I'd left it. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a composed authority in the jaw that hadn't been there when he was a young man taking his first elder posting under my hand. Looking at him now through a stranger's eyes, he was a genuinely handsome man. That had always irritated me when he was my disciple. The enforcer flanked him 2 steps back, broad-built, close-cut hair, a foundation cultivator's stillness in the way he held himself, the kind of body that had learned to wait. Yan Bo. His name appeared in the contribution records under outer security. 3 consecutive commendations for incident response, all in the past year. His gaze moved across the outer disciple row in even horizontal sweeps, unhurried, a man looking for something with a known shape. Jilan raised one hand, a small gesture, and the yard went quiet.
21 days,
he said. His voice carried without effort. It was not the projection of a cultivator forcing sound across a field, just a voice that had learned to be heard.
The Centennial Rite. I know some of you have already lost sleep over what comes after, whether the breakthrough changes things. I want to look you in the eye and tell you it doesn't. The rite is for the sect. What I carry when I step down from that dais, I carry for every hand in every yard.
40 people breathing out.
I know the stories told about this path before it was shared,
Jilan said. A pause, brief and not accidental.
The 9 dross scripture was locked behind elder rank, behind decades of service, behind doors that were never going to open. The man who held it watched you die of ash lung and wrote your names in a ledger.
Another pause.
Dross refinement is a hard road. You deserve to walk it.
The sound from the crowd grew. I stood in the front row with my orange sash and my untempered meridians and my dead man's memory, and I listened to him describe the old Cinder sovereign with that warm, certain voice. And the thing that happened inside my chest was not fury. Fury would have been cleaner. I had locked the scripture. I had given it to no one below elder rank. I had watched disciples sieve out with ash lung, and noted their names as object lessons in the inefficiency of premature distribution. Every Count Gilan had just handed to that crowd. Correct. He was using them accurately, and they were still facts. What he was not saying, what he had arranged carefully never to say, was the 9th chapter, the missing safeguard. The reason the scripture I had hoarded was not the scripture he was handing out like bread. His bread was poison, and he had made himself the most admired man in the southern reach for poisoning them more gently than I had refused to. I held that thought in place and kept my face still.
The trial victors from this cycle,
Gilan said, turning slightly toward us,
will have the honor of refining the tribute stock for the Centennial Rite, the highest grade work this yard has produced, prepared under elder supervision, distributed to every confirmed participant at the breakthrough ceremony.
He looked at us then. This was his own look, different from Yanbo's systematic sweep, the look of a man doing arithmetic behind warmth. It moved across the orange sashes, one face, the next, the next. It reached mine. One heartbeat. His expression did not change. His color did not shift. Nothing a yard hand standing at normal distance would have caught. But I had spent 30 years learning to read a junior's face down to the flicker, and I had spent 11 days in this body, learning how much faster the new one's heart could beat when the old one refused to. Then his eyes moved on.
The refinement begins in 2 days,
Gilan said, to the whole crowd again, his voice still warm.
Contribute well. You have already made me proud.
The crowd noise rose into something that might have been cheering. I stood in the front row and did not make a sound. 21 days. He had just invited me into the room where the tribute pills would be made, to help make them, under his supervision, with Yanbo watching for the refiner's mark in every firing pan. If I declined, I gave him a thread to pull. If I accepted, I walked toward the right with my own hands on the poison. The crowd filed away around me. Su Lin materialized at my left shoulder.
Those pills.
She said, quiet enough that it didn't carry.
He's handing those to everyone at the Rite.
She said it as a statement. She'd been watching the gray skin in the crowd.
Yes,
I said.
he is.
I did not tell her I was going to be the one who refined them. I started walking toward the refinement halls. Chapter 7. Ash Lung. 3 days after Gilan's tour, I was refining the poison that would kill half the people who trusted him, and no one in the East Hall knew it but me. Yanbo had divided the trial victors into stations before the hall finished warming. 12 positions, 12 practitioners, no stated logic to the arrangement. Su Lin ended up across the room with a boy named Ren from the North Yards. Steady hands, no cultivation sense worth accounting for. Convenient, except that every piece of information I needed passed through a 10-meter gap that Yanbo patrolled twice each hour. He walked the row with his hands clasped and his gaze on the firing pans, never the faces. The pans were where the evidence would be. The mark did not live in my face. It lived in the residue left in a cooling rack, the specific pressure texture of dross flame, managed by someone who had spent 40 years refining the shape of the art. I gave him nothing to find. My pills came out grade 3, technically clean, adequate. A man who had once refined grade 7 pills for his own use, deliberately capping at 3. It was the hardest refinement I had done in this body. Su Lin's pills were grade 4. She had a gift she had had no opportunity to name, and she put everything into whatever was in front of her. She had not looked at me since the lower yards. On the third evening, Ren met me outside the hall with his cap in both hands. Her brother dropped at supper, he said, black at the corners of his mouth. He can't get up. She's with him in the storage room, East Common. I calculated the walk, then I went. The room smelled of lamp oil and old char. Pei lay on a storage cot with his knees pulled to his chest and his mouth open, breathing in the wet pipe rhythm that meant the meridian channels had begun compressing surrounding tissue. He was 9 years old and built like a 7-year-old, an ash hauler's build, narrow through the shoulders, thick in the calves, black at the corners of his lips, settled deep into the tissue where wiping would not reach. Su Lin stood at the foot of the cot with her back to the door.
Knew you'd come to count something.
She said.
Your brother,
I said.
You told me what a stone spent on him was worth.
I was wrong.
That turned her. She looked at me the way you look at a firing pan that has cracked, unsure whether to trust the crack or the pan. I didn't have a better answer for the look, so I crossed to the cot and knelt. 9 years old. The black at his lips was not going to wipe off. I drew the amber spirit stone from my inner pocket and pressed it to the hollow behind his left collarbone. The 9th chapter of the 9 Draw scripture was not, at its foundation, a technique for the cultivator's own chi. It was a method for coaxing the body's nascent life chi to flush what dross refinement deposited. Every living body held a breath of it, or the heart would not beat. In a child with no cultivation training, that breath was barely enough to perceive, but it was there. I fed one thread of my own chi through the stone, carefully, far below the threshold where Tonkei's meridians would rebel, and used it to model the pattern. The stone amplified and distributed. Pei's body did the rest. His breathing changed by slow degrees. The wet pipe sound smoothed out, and his knees uncurled by increments. And after the 2nd minute, the black at his lips faded to gray, thinner than before though not gone. His color came back to something that was almost not alarming. I sat back and let the stone go cold.
Does it hold?
Until the exposure continues.
I said.
The source is the art itself, incomplete. The missing chapter is the safeguard against exactly this. Without it, the taint keeps building, regardless of what I vent.
You've got the missing chapter.
I wrote it.
I said. The lamp oil smell was heavy in the silence after that. She did not ask how a boy of 11 had written something a generation before his birth. Either she was setting it aside for later, or she already had an answer she wasn't ready to say. I let her have the silence. The backlash I had vented from Pei had passed through my hands on the way, filtered through the stone. It arrived not as pain but as recognition. The specific texture of dross accumulating without the safeguard was something I could read the way a metalworker reads the color of iron, a particular brittleness, the pressure strain of a structure loaded past its design. I had known that texture in my own meridians, decades before I understood why the 9th chapter was necessary. But the quantity in Pei was already significant. 9 years old, no cultivation base, 2 or 3 years of sect pills at most, and still the accumulation read heavy. I ran the arithmetic the way you check a calculation you suspect contains an error. The outer disciples who had practiced the 8-chapter scripture for years would carry far more. The furnace elders, refining daily, worse still. 3,000 practitioners was a conservative estimate of the sect's reach. The suppliant villages the sect had converted with dross pills, and promises extended that number further, every one of them carrying the same brittleness I had just felt in Pei's meridians. Jilan's breakthrough to nascent soul would send a surge through the entire sect's cultivation current, a wave of spiritual pressure traveling outward through every linked practitioner at once. In a healthy system, that surge was a survivable tremor, an event and nothing more. But meridians carrying untreated backlash did not absorb a surge. They conducted it, and then they fractured. I had built the 9th chapter knowing this. The mathematics had the same answer now that it had 40 years ago. And then there was the Rite. The Rite would put fresh pills in thousands of hands 6 hours before Jilan broke through. Fresh doses, given all at once, to practitioners already accumulating taint. The concentration would spike. I had not laid the timing out plainly before, set it against itself like this. Jilan had not planned a disaster. He had built one by accident, because the chapter that would have prevented it was the chapter he had never possessed.
You've gone off again.
Sulin said.
The Rite.
I said.
When Jilon makes his breakthrough, the surge will travel outward through everyone carrying the taint. Anyone who has practiced the art, taken the pills, breathed the yards long enough. Fresh doses handed out 6 hours before he breaks, so the accumulation will be at its peak.
Her jaw went tight.
The inner disciples would go first.
I said.
Deeper saturation, years of practice. The outer disciples.
I thought of Ren arranging pills in his cooling rack. The other trial victors I had catalogued without deciding to.
Many of them.
How many total?
The arithmetic had an answer. I didn't say it. I had built plans around acceptable losses before. The Cinder Sovereign's court had run on that logic. A disciple's life weighed against a position gained, the numbers examined and the cheaper option taken. I had made those calculations for 90 years, and the work had never cost me sleep. Then Jilon had beheaded me in front of everyone I had ever managed, and across 2 lives, I had not spent much time asking why the logic had never troubled me before. The gray at Pei's lips had not disappeared. It had only faded. The taint my 1 stone had slowed but not stopped. It would come back. The exposure would continue, and it would come back. And in 18 days, the Rite would push it past whatever margin I had bought tonight. My revenge had always had a body count. Jilon and his enforcers, the senior disciples who had climbed on the stolen art. I had accepted those before I accepted the plan. They had eaten from the tree without asking whose orchard it was. Pei was 9 years old. He had hauled ash because his family needed the coin. He had breathed the yards because there was no other air. He had taken the miracle pills because the foreman said they helped with the lung sickness, which they did, the same way a plug helps with a drain, except this plug was made of the water itself, and eventually the pressure went somewhere else. This was not Jilon's body count. Jilon had made the choice to distribute the incomplete art, but I had written the art that could be distributed incomplete. The scripture and its safeguard had been one structure, until I wrote them as 2 chapters, and a patient man had split them apart and handed 1 piece to the world as a gift. The hand that split them was not mine. The hand that made them splittable was.
So what?
She said. Her face hadn't moved. 9 years of reading Foreman.
I don't know yet.
I said. The calculation had already resumed. Sulin knew what I was. She had watched what the stone could do. She had a brother who would continue dying without more of them, and I had 8 stones left. These were the variables in an arrangement I had not chosen to construct. They had assembled themselves while I was occupied with Pei's meridians, and now they sat there in the obvious order. Somewhere in the East Hall, Yan Bo was walking his patrol. The lamp guttered in a draft from the hall. Pei breathed on, shallow and even, the gray at his lips a shade lighter than it had been an hour before. Outside, the night foreman's bell rang the 6th hour. 18 days until the Rite. Chapter 8. Fuel. The plan came together before the lamp burned out. 2 days I had spent turning from the obvious conclusion. The Cinder Sovereign had never flinched from the shape of a thing because its shape was ugly. So I stopped. I let the numbers sit. The Rite was 16 days out. Jilon would stand before the gathered sects and attempt a nascent soul breakthrough, using 8 chapters of the 9 dross scripture. 8 chapters whose accumulated taint, amplified by the tribute pills distributed 6 hours prior, would surge back through him at the moment of transition. The failure would be catastrophic, and it would happen where no one could deny it. The man who had built his reign on a dead man's work would come apart in full view of every allied sect in the southern reach. All I had to do was be in the crowd when it happened. The yard hands would be in the crowd too. The inner disciples with the deepest meridian saturation would fracture first. The geometry of it was inescapable. Outer disciples would go next, then the suppliant villagers who had taken sect pills for years. Pei's meridians were partially vented now, but ambient contact in the kiln rows would rebuild the taint over the next 16 days, faster than venting could hold it. I had 8 stones. 8 stones could not treat 3,000 people. 3,000, conservatively. Su Lin had gone back to the east halls. I was alone in the lower yards, crouched against the cold stone wall of the sealed kiln, the lamp turned low. I worked through each step the way I had once walked through a difficult refinement. Identify the inputs, account for the loss, confirm the yield. The yield here was Jilan's exposure and death, visible to half the southern reach. The loss was the 3,000. The inputs were 16 days of patience and 1 afternoon at the Rite. I ran the sequence. The numbers did not change. The stone floor pressed cold through my robes. Somewhere outside, a chain knocked against iron, and the lamp had burned a 1/4 inch lower before the number settled and stopped moving. 3,000. Still 3,000. A sound from the passage outside. Old Fang moved slowly, even on his best evenings. His broken knee dragged a distinct rhythm against the stone floor. The one story he had never finished telling, the lower yard collapse 12 years back. He pushed open the kiln door without knocking, because it was his yard to keep, and stood in the entrance looking at me sitting in the dark with a lamp turned too low to work by.
"Thought I saw the light,"
he said. He crossed the threshold and lowered himself onto the stepstone, bad knee extended, and sat looking at the cold face of the old furnace. His breathing was deliberate. A man who had climbed that slope in the dark before.
17 days,
he said.
16. Now.
The girl's brother looked better tonight. Whatever you did.
Temporary,
I said.
The ambient accumulation will rebuild faster than venting can hold it. He'd need to be away from the kiln rows entirely to stay clean.
Fang was quiet.
But he won't be.
No.
The lamp popped and steadied. The chain clinked again, farther off.
You're going to let the Rite go,
Fang said. He laid it down flat, the way a man states what he already knows.
You worked it out, and you're going to let it go.
His eyes were on the furnace, not on me. I said nothing.
40 years reading people in furnace yards,
he said.
Men who are planning something look different from men who haven't decided yet. You decided.
Jilan dies in front of the world,
I said.
The art is exposed as stolen. Every enforcer who survives that night knows what he was. They'd have to. It ends the same as any other path, and this one doesn't require me to stand in the open, with no cultivation base, against a peak golden core.
And the 3,000.
The backlash won't kill all of them.
How many?
I gave him the figure. The color left Fang's face gradually, the way heat leaves an unworked kiln, draining steadily until he was the same flat color as the walls.
There was a boy,
he said. His voice came out stripped, like something sanded down to the grain.
17 years old, Eastern Kiln Hall, good hands. Had the dross sense naturally, no instruction needed. When the Sovereign was still working on the 7th chapter, this boy worked out a modification to the firing sequence that improved yield by 4%.
He stopped.
The Sovereign used the modification, did not acknowledge where it came from. Knowledge was the Sovereign's property. The boy understood that.
I waited.
3 months later, there was a backlash in Kiln 4. Someone had to go into the chamber when it vented, or the whole row would have gone. The Sovereign calculated who was the most efficient loss.
He said those 2 words the way a man says the name of a wound that never closed.
Expendable skill, acceptable contribution, net gain in containment.
He looked at the floor between his boots.
The boy went in.
Fang.
There was another boy,
he said, without raising his voice.
14 when he came to the sect. No backing, no bloodline, nothing but a gift for reading dross that the Sovereign recognized and decided was useful. Took him as a personal pupil, worked him 15 hours a day, corrected him in front of the full hall when he made errors, because public shaming sharpens concentration. That was the reasoning. Gave him advancement when he produced results, and withheld it when he didn't.
He paused.
Kept him close enough to learn everything, and far enough that he always knew he was only there to be useful. 15 years of that.
The kiln was very quiet.
You know what 15 years of being someone's instrument does to a person.
Fang said.
What happens when the instrument finally understands that's all it will ever be, and the man holding it is the only thing standing between it and the path it wants?
My hands were flat against the cold stone floor. I said nothing.
That's the day you made him.
Fang said.
You ground that boy down until something in him curdled, and then you handed him exactly what he needed to destroy you. And here you stand, ready to do it again.
He looked at me directly. His face held the scored exhaustion of a man who has watched the same fire catch twice.
What's the word for that?
The lamp guttered. I had an answer. 30 years ago I had given it to other men who raised objections to other costs, and it had been precise and correct, and had satisfied no one who was not already satisfied. I did not say it. Outside, the night foreman's bell rang the second watch. 16 days. Chapter 9. The Cinder Vein. The word I had not said was efficiency. 3 men, 90 years, 3 different corridors. I had given them the word, and they had gone quiet the same way Fang had gone quiet. And I had noted the silence and moved on. The silence was confirmation of a kind. I had treated it that way. The day after Fang's question, I returned to the refinement halls and capped my output at grade 3, and gave Yanbo's observers nothing to read. One day of this. On the second morning, before first bell, an inner disciple pinned a notice to the hall board. By order of the sect master's office, all outer disciples who participated in last month's furnace trial are assigned to the eastern Cinder Vein for special ore extraction. Report to the southeast lower grounds at first bell. Contribution credits by hall weight. Overseer, Elder Disciple Yanbo. I read it twice. Then I stood in the corridor with the paper in my hand for a moment that probably looked, to anyone observing, like a boy reading something complicated and slow. The Cinder Vein. I had sealed that deposit myself, 4 years before my death. The eastern seam sat atop a convergence of dross-charged ley lines, the ore still cycling through its own corrupted current, the way an unvented furnace keeps building pressure long after you've pulled the fuel. I had run the numbers before sealing it. The backlash chi bleeding off those walls could saturate an outer disciple's unprotected meridians inside an hour and accumulate to critical taint by 2. I had sealed the vein because there was no safe extraction method without the 9th chapter's vent, and the 9th chapter was mine alone. Jilan had unsealed it. I folded the paper and went to find my boots. Su Lin was already at the muster point, arms crossed, standing apart from the 2 other outer disciples I'd seen in the refinement halls. She did not look at me when I arrived.
You've seen the board.
She said, still watching the gate.
Yes.
My brother had a bad night. 3 episodes.
A pause.
Not relevant to the expedition, I know.
She looked at the gate. I looked at the gate. Yanbo waited at the vein entrance with a small formation disc in his palm. He looked at each of us in turn. It was slower than the face sweep he ran in open court.
Orange marks on the walls. That's your extraction target. Leave bare rock alone. Don't try refining on site. Raw dross goes wrong fast when you put cultivation pressure on it in a closed space.
He sounded like he was reading.
Any meridian pressure at all, you exit. No docking, no questions, you exit.
His eyes moved to me on the last sentence, then off. The vein took us. 10 paces in, the air changed. With my old seal gone and nothing replacing it, the convergence cycled free, and the dross chi bleeding off the walls carried the quality of a laboratory I had walked away from deliberately, lower than heat, a saturation that sat in the back of the throat and didn't clear. The 9 dross scripture routes raw dross as resource rather than contaminant. The cultivation path was built to refine what other methods reject. But without the 9th chapter, that same path becomes a container with no drain. The dross builds in the meridian nodes instead of venting outward. A practitioner running G-Land's 8-chapter version in this space would poison herself with her own circulation, which made the Cinder Vein a very efficient assignment for a man who wanted a trial victor dead and the cause left to speculation. 20 minutes in, the youngest of the other outer disciples bent double coughing, sharp wet sounds, dark at the corner of his mouth. The group lead sent him out immediately, and the rest of us kept working, because the contribution points would not extract themselves and the ore seam marked in orange was producing cleanly, and nobody wanted to come back empty-handed from a special elder disciple assignment. Su Lin worked beside me. Her circulation moved in the pattern of someone managing saturation on will alone. Good discipline, and not enough for much longer. If I did nothing, taint accumulation incapacitated me inside the hour, and her too. If I used the 9th chapter's vent, I could route the accumulated toxin outward through the skin, rather than letting it condense in the meridian nodes. I would survive. The pressure clearing the vent pushed through the surrounding space might keep her functional, but the vent's spiritual pattern was distinctive. Yan Bo had a formation disc. The pattern would be recorded. A child performing a technique absent from every sect curriculum is not a gifted autodidact. There was no version of this calculation where I survived without answering Ji-Lan's question for him. Fang's face. The scored lines of it. The same fire, catching twice. I began the vent. The 9th chapter, in a properly tempered body, runs as a secondary circulation alongside the primary dross refinement loop. It is a parallel channel that routes accumulated toxin outward through the skin as spent qi, rather than letting it build in the meridian nodes. In Tankei's body, with its first-tier meridians barely 2 weeks into development, there was no parallel channel. I threaded the vent pattern through whatever pathways I'd built since the furnace trial and sent it through junctions not designed to carry the load. 3 junctions burned simultaneously. The sensation moved up my left arm and across my shoulder, like fire tracing a line of salt, steady and unhurried. I kept the circulation moving. Stop it, and the taint would kill me. Run, and Yan Bo would read the partial vent signature in my disrupted qi flow, and I would be dead more slowly. I had no choices I liked. I kept the circulation moving. The pressure clearing spread a small sphere around me. It was not enough to scrub the ambient air, only enough to slow the saturation rate for anything within 2 arm spans. Su Lin didn't look at me. She worked, and breathed a little easier, and didn't ask why. A 4th junction burned, then 2 more I hadn't predicted, where the improvised routing overloaded a meridian wall I had underestimated. I finished the haul quota with 6 secondary meridians compromised, and my hands shaking in a way I chose not to examine. I came out last. Yan Bo was where I had left him. He looked at the haul. He looked at me. My legs sat down. I let them and ran the damage.
6 secondary meridians compromised. Projected recovery, 4 to 7 days under active cultivation. Minimum spirit stone cost to prevent scarring, 2 stones.
2 stones I had not budgeted for. 4 compromised secondaries that would scar shut if I pushed Tankei's cultivation too hard in the days following. 8 stones remaining. 4 already committed to the tempering schedule I needed before the rite. The arithmetic was still solvable, differently than I had planned it 2 days ago. Yan Bo crouched in front of me.
Longest shift by a good margin.
The seam was productive.
Most outer disciples are symptomatic inside 30 minutes.
He turned the formation disc once in his palm, without looking at it.
You weren't.
Good constitution.
He looked at me the way you look at a door after the lock has turned without a key. Then he stood, pressed 2 fingers to the disc, and walked toward the upper sect. I sat on the slope and let my burned meridians cool. Below the rock, the ley line cycled. 40 years without management. 40 years of every 8-chapter practitioner adding unvented taint to the ambient flow, and now it fed back into the ore we had just extracted. The ore that would be refined into tribute pills for the rite, distributed to every hand in attendance. 15 days. I already knew what Yanbo's report would contain. I had written the 9th chapter. I knew what its pressure signature looked like on a formation disk, and I knew that Jilan had spent 36 years trying to recover it, and I knew precisely what he would say when he understood what had been recorded. The report reached Jilan 2 days later. The account that came back to me was brief, second-hand, passed down the same channels he used to move orders. He had received the disk's reading without comment, they said. Only one sentence of his survived the retelling, and it was the part that mattered. Only the author knew that vent. The order that followed was to kill the boy, quietly, before the rite. 15 days. The sect master was no longer searching. He was moving. Chapter 10. Kill him quietly. He came 2 nights after the Cinder Vein. I was awake already. 6 compromised secondary meridians don't mend quietly. They run their arguments through the small hours in a language of heat and pins. So I caught the moment the stillness changed shape. It was not footsteps. Foundation cultivators don't announce themselves that way. What I caught was an absence taking form. The rats had gone quiet. The cooling ash had stopped settling, and the world flattened the way it flattens when something large and patient holds itself very still and waits for the smaller thing to move. I rolled off the mat and put the kiln wall at my back before I was fully conscious. Yanbo stepped from the shadow between rows 20 and 21, wearing plain gray and no rank sash.
Don't run,
He said, flat and final, the same tone he used on formation disk readings when the numbers were already settled.
I've had the grid access wards sealed. You go nowhere tonight.
He was not wrong. My maintenance papers covered rows 18 through 22, and every entry point would be keyed to his chi lock now. 30 meters of abandoned kiln row stood between us. Foundation establishment. Early stage but stable as old stone. His pressure filling the row the way water fills a vessel. I was early chi condensation, with 6 meridians still raw from the vein. The Cinder Sovereign's knowledge did not change the arithmetic. A river cannot be held in a cracked jar.
Then we stay.
I said.
Most people have questions.
Yanbo said, walking at the pace of a man already certain.
I answer them after. Cleaner.
He believed that. It was probably true. I ran the 9th chapter's geometry in the back of my mind while he closed the distance. The vent principle, reversed. Instead of pushing taint outward through a safe channel, you open a conduit facing inward, a door hung wrong, and the corrupted chi rushes back along the path it came from. A theoretical annotation, 3rd paragraph, page 7, sealed with the rest of the chapter in Kiln 7, 30 years ago. I had written it, and Yanbo had spent years practicing the 8-chapter art. His meridians were threaded with the same slow poison that killed yard rats. I had measured that saturation at the Cinder Vein. I knew exactly how much taint a committed Foundation practitioner could hold before it showed, and exactly what calling it home all at once would do. The cost. To open the conduit I needed his chi to reach me, to pass my surface defenses, and make contact, and give me something to work the technique through. That meant holding still while he struck. My compromised meridians would not survive a clean Foundation hit. He closed to 15 meters. I moved first. I went toward him, not away, cutting left below his natural striking angle, using Tan K's small body as briefly an advantage. He read the feint and adjusted, and the palm strike that caught my chest was calculated. Ribs, not organs, incapacitating, kept quiet, enough to hold me and keep the kill silent. Pain is data. I held the conduit open and waited. His chi arrived like a river through a needle. Foundation pressure against untempered chi condensation meridians, and the first secondary meridian gave. I turned the vent. The taint was everywhere. 30 years of 8-chapter practice, no safeguard. Meridians threaded black with accumulated dross from the day he first circulated the stolen scripture. I gave it somewhere to go. I opened the door facing back toward its source, and the whole accumulated weight of it pivoted, in Yanbo's channels, and rushed home. It hit him at the core. He went to one knee without a sound. Then a short, broken exhale, the breath of a man who has just reached into his foundation and found it hollow, and the blood drained from his face until it had the gray of wet kiln clay. His hand found the kiln wall.
What?
The word ended there. I had won the exchange. My left side had caved, 2 ribs at minimum, and the secondary meridians that had survived the Cinder Vein were gone now. A slow wave of cold spreading from throat to hip. I was sitting against the opposite wall. I hadn't decided to sit. Yanbo was down but not finished. Taint Backlash wouldn't kill a Foundation cultivator, it would incapacitate one. His right hand found a formation disc, not the reading disc but the other one. He pressed it, and the ward alert went to the upper sect. Then he looked at me, with something that had no name in my vocabulary of useful states. The professional flatness was gone, and underneath it was something raw, the way stripped bark is raw, put there by a fact he hadn't expected the numbers to produce. His right hand rose again. The chi in it was thin, diminished, but I had nothing left, and the angle was right, and the arithmetic ran itself in the time it took him to draw back. Moving would tear what remained. Holding still would close accounts. Something hit his arm sideways from behind. Su Lin. She had the old kiln iron from the far end of the row, swung with both hands, and the redirection sent his half-formed strike sideways, though not far enough. The chi-laced edge caught her along the ribs, low on the left, and the gash opened immediately the wrong color, dark at the margins. Foundation chi poison seeping into the tissue rather than a clean cut. She kept standing.
Move,
She said to me. The iron was at her side. Her left arm pressed her ribs, her tunic already soaking through.
You can walk. I've seen you walk worse.
The cinder venom terminus was in my inner pocket. Dark green, iridescent, the one irreplaceable item in my entire cache, kept through 90 years of the previous life, and 30 more underground. It was made to kill, never meant for a yard girl bleeding in the dark of the lower rows. I split it and pressed half into her wound. The terminus was refined dross essence at fatal concentration. In a healthy meridian system, it would rupture everything it touched. But Su Lin's meridians were already saturated with years of ash lung, and now with the overflow from Yanbo's struck formation. And the pill did what the 9th chapter did when run correctly. It called the poison, and vented it. The gash began to close at the edges. Imperfect. The remaining half would matter later. I put it in my pocket, and did not think about what I had done. The thinking would come. It always came. But right now there was Su Lin's face, still steady, still working out the numbers, the iron slack at her side, and the sovereign's arithmetic ran its figures, and the column refused to total. Behind us, Yanbo was breathing in short pulls, still on one knee. He had been watching since the moment I turned the vent, since the moment he understood what the technique was.
The vein signature.
His voice was careful now, stripped of the certainty he'd walked in with.
Jilan swore the old sovereign destroyed that chapter before he died, that it died with him.
He coughed, a wet sound.
He told me when I was 17, said the incomplete art was all that could be recovered, and he told me because…
He stopped. The gray in his face deepened.
Jilan killed the old sovereign. The charge was forged. I was one of the 4 who carried the order.
A breath.
I kept it. And your…
Boots. 6 sets, rounding row 20 at a run with lanterns.
Now,
Su Lin said. She grabbed my arm and we ran. She had the path already. 3 years of maintenance rounds, gaps in the kiln rows that weren't on any map because they had never needed to be. I followed her through the dark between the rows, broken ribs working against every step, the half-pill warm in my pocket. Behind us, the enforcers called Yanbo's name. Then they called a description. Then they split into the rows. Su Lin pulled us into a dry drainage culvert, and we stopped, pressed flat, her breath loud and mine shallow, because my left side didn't allow anything else. Above us, the lanterns swung away.
You split the pill.
She said, not as an accusation, just working it out.
Yes.
I said.
The one from the furnace. The one you said you couldn't spend on pay.
She was not wrong. The cost had been identical. Tonight it had been higher.
Yes.
I said. She went quiet. I lay in the dark and thought about Yan Bo's unfinished sentence. He had been about to name what I was. Ji-lan would know now, from the triggered ward alert, that the clean elimination had become something else, that the yard boy had run the reversed vent and survived it, and there was only one person who could know that technique existed. 13 days. The proof Fang had buried for 30 years had never found the right moment. It had one now.
Can you walk?
I asked.
I've been walking.
She said. We came out of the culvert and moved through the dark toward Kiln Row 7. Chapter 11. The Keeper's Proof. The door to Fang's cellar room was 2 feet of iron-banded oak under Kiln Row 7, reachable only through the maintenance culvert and a half-collapsed stair no one had cleared since Mu Yan's time. Su Lin found it before I did. She knocked twice, then once. Old furnace code. I had not told her that. We waited. The culvert dripped. Above us came bootfalls on gravel. Ji-lan's men still ranging through the dead yards, searching for whatever the ward alert had named. They'd have a description by now. 2 outer disciples, one of them a small boy, last seen near the south drainage. The door opened. Old Fang checked Su Lin's arm first. She'd wrapped the wound herself, tight enough, but the cloth was dark. Then he moved to me. The furnace keeper's look, cataloging what was cracked and what might still hold.
Both of you,
He said. A statement, flat.
Inside.
I said. He let us in. The cellar smelled of cured char and old oil. A single fire bowl in the corner, barely fed, gave enough light to work by. Fang lowered himself onto his 3-legged stool, with the careful economy of a man managing a bad knee for 20 years. Su Lin found the wall and pressed her back to it, breathing through her teeth.
Yan Bo.
Fang said.
What's left of him? He won't walk for a month.
His men will be in these yards before dawn.
Then, we don't have until dawn.
I held his gaze across the fire bowl.
You said you buried something. I need it now.
He did not move immediately. He sat with his hands on his knees, wearing the same look he'd had on day 6 and on day 8 and every time since, a man checking his sums one final time before committing the figures.
I kept it through 4 sect masters.
He said.
Through the rewriting of the records and the burning of the old library. Through every audit Yan Bo's men ran on the row-keeper's quarters.
He reached 2 fingers under the edge of the fire bowl's stone base and pressed. A section of the floor shifted an inch, no more, and he worked a narrow cedar box free from the cavity beneath.
I didn't keep it for a dead man's vengeance.
He set the box between us. I crossed the room and opened it. The decree was on yellow sect paper, 30 years dry, the ink still sharp. Cultivation of demonic arts, defilement of the pure dross path, endangerment of the sect's spiritual lineage. Each charge sealed in green wax, with Ji-lan's master sigil. The older, smaller seal of a senior inner disciple, the one he'd carried when he was still my student, well before the coiled jade vine of his sect mastership. He had signed my death warrant with a disciple's hand. My fingers went still on the paper. The defilement charge. That one had survived into the histories, the one Su Lin had pulled from bedtime stories on day 9. 30 years of children warned away from his name. Ji-lan had taken the 9th chapter, the art that vented poison and prevented the taint cascade, and called it the source of the taint. He had named the cure the wound. I set the decree down and lifted the token. A simple disc, black iron, stamped with the cinder wheel sigil. The moment it settled in my palm, the metal shifted, below sight, in the same register as the furnace seal on day 9. Something reading the soul inside Tan K's body, and finding what it was looking for. The disc warmed, A faint light came up in it, exactly the color of a controlled dross flame.
What is that?
Proof. The decree names the charges. The token answers to the soul that owned it. Together they show the charges were forged, and that the art Jilan claims as his inheritance came from the man he executed.
Standing where?
She shifted against the wall, and her breath caught sharp for a moment, quickly swallowed.
In a boy's body, 12 days, no rank.
I did not answer that,
The tribute cases are already moving.
Fang said. He had not looked away from me.
Row kitchens, elders to hall stewards, stewards to row chiefs. By the time the rite comes, they'll have reached every quarter.
12 days. The pills already in motion. The numbers had not changed since the refinement hall. The tribute pills were drawn from Cinder Vein ore, 40 years of unvented taint baked into the raw material. Every recipient carrying a baseline from sect pills over the last 5 years. The moment Jilan's breakthrough surge traveled outward uncontrolled, the backlash would race through every dosed meridian in range like fire through dry reed. 3,000 was the conservative count. It remained conservative,
The only moment the proof carries weight
I said.
is in front of the entire sect. Allied elders, outer disciples, row hands, everyone assembled at the rite. After Jilan's dead, it becomes a losing argument. His successor controls the records.
Then you need to be there before he breaks through.
I need to be there while he's breaking through. There's a window between initiation and completion, long enough to stop the pills from being consumed, long enough to show them the decree and the token, and what the mark looks like on someone who carries it in his blood.
I kept my voice level.
To show them the mark, I have to ignite it in the open, in front of Jilan's sect, his allied guests, and every enforcer in his employ.
The firebowl popped once.
You'd be showing your face.
Yes.
After everything you've done to not show your face.
Yes.
She went quiet. The breathing through her teeth had stopped. Now she was holding the air still in her chest.
You were going to let them die.
She said.
Before.
Yes.
What changed?
My hand moved without intention to the spot in my inner robe where the remaining half of the cinder venom terminus sat. The half I had kept. The half I had split off and used to vent the chi poison from her wound, when the full pill was the only surplus I had, and the choice had not registered as loss at the moment I made it.
The feedstock estimate changed.
I said.
The Cinder Vein ore is more saturated than I originally calculated. 3,000 was never the real figure.
Something in her face had gone still and flat, the way a furnace lid looked when the pressure behind it was wrong.
She didn't ask about the ore.
Fang said. No one spoke.
30 years I kept this.
He said at last, half to himself.
Row keeper's wages, 4 sect masters, asking questions about the old days, and 3 audits on top of that.
He looked down at the cedar box.
Wasn't waiting for a chance at the man who signed the decree, and I wasn't waiting to settle anything.
He looked up.
I want to know the district doesn't lose another 3,000. That's all I got left to want.
He pushed the box another inch toward me. At the base of the stairs I stopped. The decree and the token sat, folded inside my inner robe, pressed against the broken ribs. 12 days. The pills already in the east quarter. More moving by morning. There was one move remaining. It required a platform and a crowd. Jilan mid-transition with his stolen art unraveling, and someone standing in front of all of it with his soul signature burning open, legible to anyone with the sensitivity to read it. A furnace yard boy who was a 90-year-old dead man. Both, at once, in the same borrowed body. The Cinder Sovereign had never stood before a crowd to be identified. 90 years, and he had let no one look at his face and name it for his.
Sulin.
I did not turn.
How many row kitchens have the tribute cases reached?
3, maybe 4. East Quarter chiefs were collecting tonight.
A pause, shorter than I expected.
Could be 5 by morning.
I need a distribution map before the rite seals the yards, and I need you on the eastern steps with the decree when it begins.
Nothing from the stair behind me.
And you?
Furnace dais,
I said.
where everyone can see me.
She didn't answer. I started up the stair. Behind me, her breathing had changed. A small, careful catch at the top of each inhale. The sound of a wound that had opened again. She did not speak of it. I offered nothing. We went up. Chapter 12. The Centennial Rite. Dawn found the east yards already full. I'd been among them since the third bell, positioned 3 rows behind the outer disciple tribute stations, close enough to the furnace dais to reach it in 40 steps if the crowd gave. It wouldn't give. Every yard hand in the sect had turned out, and the 3 allied delegations from the southern reach had doubled the count. Coiled vine banners in green hung from every pillar. The air carried incense and coal smoke, and something floral that had no business here. Festival flowers, bought with spirit stones, for an occasion that had no need of them. A yard hand 2 rows ahead had a girl on his shoulders, 4 years old, maybe 5, and she was pulling at his ear, pointing at the nearest banner, wanting him to look at the green. He obliged her, craning his neck up and to the left, as though he hadn't noticed before. Sulin found me in the press before sunrise. Her left side moved wrong, held still when she could, which threw a compensating list into her shoulders. The wound went unspoken between us.
Decree is folded inside my outer collar.
She said, barely moving her lips.
Eastern steps. I'll be in position before the first bell.
The crowd between her and those steps was 60 paces deep, thick with outer disciples and lay worshippers, and the Southern Reach delegation in their foreign gray.
If they move to seize before the mark reads clear, show it then, and only then.
I said.
The decree proves intent. The mark proves identity. Paper can be argued. The mark cannot.
And if they take you before the crowd reads it?
The furnace dais rose to the north, ceremonial black iron, 3 times the scale of anything in the working yards. The coiled vine crest stamped into every firebox door. Ji-Lan had commissioned it for this rite. I knew the specifications because I'd drafted the original form 40 years before he was born.
Then Fang gets the token to the outer gatekeeper, and they read it to the delegates before they leave.
I said.
The plan survives without me.
Sulin's jaw worked. She looked at the furnace dais a moment too long, the way a person looks at a thing they have already decided not to say.
Right,
She said.
the plan survives without you.
She turned and went into the crowd before I could answer the thing she hadn't said. Ji-Lan ascended the dais at the second bell. Full sect master regalia, deep veridian, gold trim. The coiled jade vine worked in actual thread of gold across the shoulders. He moved the way a man moves when he has been loved by crowds long enough that the love feels like weather, simply present, not remarkable. 6 elders flanked him. Yan Bo was nowhere visible, which meant he was somewhere specific. The tribute stations opened. Inner disciples in pressed gray robes began distributing the centennial pills, palm-sized lacquered cases, 1 per household. The miracle the sect had spent 30 years building its name on. 30 years of dross backlash accumulating in every meridian that had ever touched this art. Every case that opened was a clock, and all the clocks were running. I moved through the press toward the refinery station. Ji-Lan raised one hand, and the murmur died.
32 years ago,
He said.
I carried a dead man's art out of a furnace that was meant to bury it. The old masters called it garbage, the waste of wasted things. I called it bread.
The crowd loved this. They always loved this part. I had heard the speech 3 times now, in different yards, in different registers, always with the same pauses in the same places.
The Centennial Rite does not mark my ascension. It marks yours. Every yard hand who breathes clean air because of this path. Every outer disciple who found cultivation where there was only smoke. Today, I climb so that you do not have to wonder whether the man who made this path can walk it himself.
Applause rose in a wave. The Southern Reach delegations clapped with it, calculating their interests behind their polite faces. The outer edge of the refinery station. A supervising elder glanced at my disciple token and waved me toward the row of secondary furnaces, demonstration kilns, for show refinement during the ceremony. 6 other disciples already at their stations, 4 from the trial. None looked at me long enough to remember they'd seen me in a culvert 2 nights ago. Jilan settled into his posture at the dais center. Breakthrough stance, weight grounded, hands at core position, eyes closing. Around me the crowd went quiet, in the way crowds do when something large is approaching that most of them cannot name. The golden core pressure built. Even from 40 steps it moved against the air like the sky before lightning. Jilan's cultivation was genuine. Whatever else he had become, he hadn't wasted the 30 years. This was the work of a man who had devoted himself absolutely to the thing he took. Whether he'd known the 9th chapter was missing when he stole the art, whether he'd found the gap later, when the first ash-lung signs appeared in the yards, and told himself the cost was acceptable, it changed nothing about what came next. I opened the dross flame. It was no full refinement. Nothing was loaded in the secondary furnace. Nothing there to work on. Only the chi moving in the pattern 90 years had ground into my soul. The pattern no one else had ever practiced the same way, specific as a voice to a throat. The dross flame rose from the firing aperture and turned the color of old coal finding air. The refiner's mark blazed from my hands. A ripple went through the spiritual pressure of the grounds. No sound and no light. Only the cultivator sense equivalent of a stone dropped into still water. Every practitioner on those grounds who had ever touched the 9 dross scripture would feel that signature the way you feel the echo of something you thought was buried. The hand of the art's true author. The dead man's mark. Out of a furnace yard boy's thin and mortal fingers. Jilan's golden core rotation stuttered. His eyes opened. 40 steps away, across the full crowd, the single unguarded instant came and went before his mask returned. Something old and small crossing his face. Not guilt, not grief. The expression of a man who has spent 30 years carefully not looking at a door, and the door has opened. He collected himself in less than a breath. He looked at the crowd, then at me, a yard boy in outer disciple gray, standing at a secondary kiln with the dead Cinder Sovereign's dross flame pouring from his palms, then at the crowd again. When Jilan smiled, it reached his eyes.
Friends,
he said, and his voice held the same warmth it always held, the same careful resonance, his teacher's craft still in it, the shape of a voice that had once moved furnace yards on a different man's behalf.
something has come to interrupt us today. I had hoped it would not come to this, but I think honesty requires I name what you're feeling.
A murmur in the crowd. The inner disciples' hands had gone to their waists.
The scripture the old sovereign hoarded leaves a particular mark in the chi. You have all practiced it. You know the feel of that hand.
A pause, placed perfectly.
What you feel now belongs to no living cultivator. The old Cinder Sovereign believed he owned everything he touched. He clings to that belief, even in death.
Sound from the crowd. Something shapeless, collective, afraid.
A demon's ghost has crawled into a servant,
Jilan said, each word placed clean and unhurried.
to ruin the man who fed you. The thing wearing that child's face is not a boy. It is a hunger that was denied its throne, borrowing flesh to take it back.
The crowd had gone very still, the kind of still that precedes a single unified movement.
Seize the possessed thing,
He said.
gently. It is not the child's fault.
The inner disciples moved. The mark was still blazing from my hands, the only proof of identity that could not be forged, the only thing no decree or enforcer could argue away. Close it down, and I was just a boy in stolen robes. Hold it, and I was still proof. If anyone here had the will to look at proof, rather than at Jilan's hands directing them where to look. The first enforcer reached the refinery station's edge. Behind him the crowd parted, faces cycling through fear, and something older than fear, the expression people wear when they have been given permission to stop deciding for themselves. 40 steps to the dais. G-Lan's breakthrough initiation hung suspended between start and completion. The golden core balanced on its edge like a coal on the lip of a kiln vent. The second enforcer was 10 steps out. The third and fourth flanked wide through the tribute station crowd, cutting off the south exit. I did not close the flame. I did not move. Chapter 13. The 9th chapter. The first enforcer's hand closed on my collar. I let him take it. The refiner's mark still blazed from my hands. Dross flame, the color of dying coals, the specific orange-black of a kiln run past its feed, and the crowd pressed back in concentric rings from that light. G-Lan on the dais with his golden core balanced at the threshold. The second enforcer 10 steps out. The tribute stations behind me still open, still distributing. Then the dais cracked. The stone held. It was the air above it that gave. Something in the spiritual pressure of the square split along a seam I recognized from the inside. The way you recognize a sound you have only ever made yourself. G-Lan's golden core rotation stuttered, and the accumulated backlash from 30 years of the truncated art surged backward through the channel he had opened to push toward nascent soul. Every pill refined without a vent. Every disciple who had breathed the corrupted output. Every tribute case open and distributing in the eastern stations right now. He had tried to climb through a flue choked with ash. The pressure hit before the sound did. The spiritual current folded inward like a collapsing lung. G-Lan made a sound I had never heard from him in either life. Small, stripped of everything, and his knees found the dais stone. The enforcer's grip loosened.
Stabilize,
G-Lan said. The warm voice was gone. What came out was hoarse, and it stopped short of where sentences end.
Someone, stabilize the...
No one moved, because no one in the sect could. The 9th chapter was the stabilization. I had never written it down for an audience. The outward surge hit me first. It came through the ambient current like a tide reversal, a wave of accumulated dross poison racing outward from G-Lan's breaking core toward every meridian it had ever touched. The inner disciples in the front row went rigid, black streaks spreading up their throats above their collars. One woman folded sideways before her companion caught her. 3,000, my own number, from my own calculation, 15 days ago. I stood still for 3 seconds and counted what letting this proceed would cost. The inner disciples first, the outer disciples behind them, the furnace yard hands in the eastern stations, Su Lin's brother among them. 8 days past the point where a second hit left him anything. Every suppliant who had pressed a tribute pill between their teeth in the last hour. 3,000 was a floor. I had known that when I wrote the figure down. The enforcer who had grabbed my collar stepped back from me. There had been a version of this moment where I stood here and watched G-Lan die in front of his sect. There had been a version of me who had planned exactly that, who had run the arithmetic clean and called it justice. I walked toward the dais. The 9th chapter is not a dramatic technique. I wrote it as maintenance, the unglamorous back end of the dross path, a sustained, controlled vent that opens the practitioner's own channels as an outflow conduit, directing accumulated poison downward through the feet into the earth rather than letting it crest. Any yard hand who had practiced the first 8 chapters could learn it in a week. G-Lan had never had a week. I reached the foot of the dais steps as the second wave built. The enforcer there raised a hand. I walked through it directly. I had nothing to spare for force. And he did not push back because G-Lan on the stone above us had gone gray as a quenched ingot, and the enforcer's body had already made its own decision. 53 steps to G-Lan. Tan K's meridians, 6 of 12 secondary pathways compromised, primary channels barely at the 3rd layer of chi condensation. The 9th chapter at this scale, venting a collapsed golden core's accumulated backlash through a body that had barely learned to hold its own chi, would not kill me cleanly. It would do the other thing. I went up the steps.
9 Draw Scripture. 9th chapter Safeguard. Vent conduit active. Host meridian load. Critical. Cascade arrest in progress.
My shadow crossed Jilan, and his head came up. His golden core was unwinding in real time, the light going wrong, the heat becoming chaotic. His face held something older than hatred, and older than the mask of the warm Verdant sovereign. It was the face of a man at the end of something he had been losing without knowing it.
You.
He said. One word. The voice of a 14-year-old who had just been handed a task he had not asked for and would not refuse. I sat beside him on the dais stone and placed my hands on his shoulders and opened the vent. It came through me like weather. Not only pain, but pressure in every direction at once. The sensation of a furnace vent doing its job in a body that was not designed to be a furnace. The dross poisoned Jilan's collapsing core released, went outward through the ambient current, and I caught it. Not all of it, the way a vent cannot catch everything, but enough, redirected downward through the intact secondary conduits, and out through the feet into the stone, into the earth below the stone, grounded against the sect's own deep fire wellspring, the way the original scripture had always intended. The crowd's rigidity eased in stages. The woman who had folded was breathing. The outward wave crested and broke, and did not reach the eastern stations with force enough to fracture. 40 seconds. The crowd was silent in a way crowds rarely are, past holding breath, past the moment where holding breath made sense. Jilan was still alive. A golden core does not unwind all at once. It takes time, and time was what the sect was now watching us occupy together on the dais stone. The visiting delegations from the southern reach who had come to witness an ascension stood very still.
You performed it.
He said, not accusing, arriving at a fact.
Only the author.
Only the author, I said. What I had just done, in front of the sect elders, the allied dignitaries, and the furnace yard hands pressed against the square's edges, was the third proof, and the cleanest, because it could not be forged, and could not be reframed as a demon's trick. A demon's ghost does not perform the safeguard. A demon benefits from the poison. Jilan's hands were flat on the stone. His core light was the color of a lamp running out of oil.
I gave it to them,
he said, still working for the argument somewhere inside him.
The art. They were dying in the yards, and you hoarded it. I gave it to them.
8 chapters, I said. You gave them 8 chapters and called it a gift. He said nothing. You knew, I said. Yanbo told you at 17 that the 9th chapter died with me. You knew what the missing chapter meant, and you distributed the art anyway.
They were dying faster without it.
That was true. They were dying slower with it, I said at last. You bought 30 years of slower, and called it salvation, and then built a Centennial Rite on the same feedstock. His breathing had changed, shallower now, the core unraveling past the point the body's own mechanisms could compensate. He turned his head toward the crowd below, the yard hands, the inner disciples finding their feet, the southern delegations that had come to witness an ascension and were witnessing something else entirely.
Why?
Jilan said. It was a real question this time, the kind a man asks when he has run out of the thinking that produces answers on its own.
The lowly nothings,
he said.
The fuel, the ash haulers.
His eyes came back to me.
The man you were would have left them, would have let the mathematics run.
A breath.
So why?
The old sovereign would have had an efficient answer. The old sovereign had run a sect on efficient answers for 90 years, and trained a disciple so thoroughly in the logic of efficient loss that the disciple had eventually applied it to his teacher. Jilan's face had shed the Verdant sovereign entirely. What remained was the face underneath, which I had last seen when its owner was 17 years old, standing at a vent kiln's edge holding a dead classmate's wrist. Because that man is the reason you are dying on this stone, I said. He held that for 3 long breaths. The core light flickered.
I would have burned them all,
he said, voice stripped of everything that wasn't fact.
To get here, I know that.
I know that too, I said. It was not forgiveness. Yanbo was dead, and the 4 men who had carried out the execution decree had followed orders, and the 17-year-old who had learned to follow orders had learned it from me. But Jilan had asked a real question, and the real answer was not arithmetic. The core light went out. Below the dais, Su Lin had reached the foot of the steps, the decree folded in her hands. Old Fang stood at the outer gate with the cinder wheel token, and even from this distance it burned orange-black against his palm. Some of the southern delegates were already in murmured conference. Some of them had seen this refiner's mark before, 30 years back, and would remember it when they needed to. I did not stand up from the dais stone right away. There was a sovereign's seat somewhere behind the dais, and it would wait. The yards held people with ash-damaged meridians who needed to learn the 9th chapter from its author, and the tribute cases in the eastern stations needed to be collected and destroyed before anyone else consumed them, and Su Lin's brother needed one final round of care to clear what remained in his channels, and none of that looked anything like the revenge I had carried back from death. It looked like work. I stood up. Chapter 14. Furnace. Reforged. Jilan's question was still in the air when the enforcers came to take the body. No one touched me. 3 elder overseers from allied sects stepped forward and then stopped at the edge of the dais, looking at each other the way men do when they need someone else to speak first. The crowd below had gone quiet. It was the quiet of people whose map of 30 years had just been redrawn, standing very still until they could work out where they were. Elder Shan from the Inkwater sect spoke. He was old enough to have been at the original certification ceremony, the one where Jilan had presented the 8-chapter art as his gift to the Southern Reach, and he wore that history in the set of his mouth. "The sovereign's seat," he said. "The succession cannot stand empty." I looked at the chair. High-backed, carved in coiled jade vine, Jilan's mark cut over the iron cinder wheel that had once been mine. 30 years of someone else's aesthetic on furniture that had held me while I wrote the 9th chapter. The old sovereign would have sat down before the body was cold. He would have sat down, started dictating terms, called it efficient leadership, and somewhere in the furnace yards a 14-year-old boy with a gift for draw sense would have been watching his new master's hands, learning what a man was supposed to want.
No,
I said. Elder Shan waited for elaboration. I didn't give it to him. He had the next 30 days to sort the succession question with the other sects. I had work that morning. The tribute cases came first. 3 stations were still distributing through the eastern quarter. Su Lin had moved before I was off the dais. By the time I reached Kiln Row 6, she was there with Old Fang and 2 outer disciples who had, from watching the dais, understood which way things now stood. We collected 73 pills and locked the remaining supply in the sealed kiln where Fang had kept his 30-year watch over a fire bowl and a cedar box he couldn't unseal.
Host meridian load, elevated. Secondary meridian recovery. 4 of 6 compromised channels functional. Projected full recovery, 11 days.
11 days. The same span I'd been given to reach the furnace trial. The numbers had no sense of irony. That was apparently my job. Pei was on a pallet in Fang's quarters, the same coal-smelling room where the cedar box had finally been opened. He was 9 years old and had the gray color of ash lung in its 3rd stage, past the point where the body protests and into the stage where it simply closes. Su Lin stepped back when I came in and cleared a stool without being asked. She stood with her hands folded. Running the 9th chapter's vent through an untempered child required finer work than I'd done this week. In the Cinder Vein and with Yen Bo both, I'd driven the vent hard and fast, scorching secondary channels to buy the result. This was the opposite. Open the conduit, coax the accumulated taint toward the vent point gradually. Let the body's own life breath carry it out instead of forcing it. Pei's life breath was strong. That was the only number that had ever mattered for this. He coughed once, hard, and the expulsion was black. Then he breathed. Su Lin's hand went over her mouth. She was shaking and turned partly away, not quite far enough, and I didn't say anything that would have made it smaller.
He'll need clean air for the next week.
I said.
The channels are clear but not yet clean.
I know.
Her voice had steadied ahead of her hands.
I'll keep him off the firing row.
A pause.
Thank you.
I stayed until the gray started leaving his knuckles. Old Fang was at the kiln door when I came out. He leaned on his staff as always, left side for the bad hip, and he held the silence a moment. He just looked at me with the expression he'd worn in the lower yards when he'd named the day I sent a 17-year-old into a venting kiln and called it efficient loss. Then he lowered his head. It was slow and deliberate, aimed at something he'd been carrying a long time. He set it down by degrees, the way you set down a weight you stopped feeling until the moment it was no longer there.
The yards need someone to teach the 9th chapter,
He said.
before the next set of outer disciples finds out the hard way what happens without the vent.
I know.
Don't hoard it.
I know.
I said. He lifted his head. His eyes were dry.
Then get started.
I lit the furnace at dawn, with 11 outer disciples watching from the yardside wall. Some from the trial roster, others I didn't know, 2 who were clearly inner court, and trying not to look it. The morning cold came off the stone in sheets. The furnace pushed back against it the moment the draft caught. There was a girl at the back, 12 years old, maybe younger, with the ash-gray tinge at her knuckles that meant firing row work since before she was old enough to have asked for it. She was watching my hands the way apprentices do when they expect any attention to cost them something.
You?
I said.
In the back. Come up to the firing line.
She checked behind her first. Then she came forward, slowly, and stood at the intake panel and looked at the furnace mouth like it owed her something.
Put your hands here.
I placed mine on the draft panel.
Keep them light. Just feel what it does when the draft moves clean. That's the first thing.
She put her hands where I showed her, gray to the second knuckle.
How long have you been working the rows?
Since I was 6, she said.
That's 3 years of draw sense you've been building without knowing it.
I said.
We're going to need all of it.
She looked up then. For a moment her hands pressed harder against the panel, as if she was making sure it was real. I had spent 90 years keeping this chapter locked in a private furnace, because knowledge hoarded was survival purchased. Then I had spent another 30 years dead because of it.
The 9th chapter begins like this.
I said, and showed her.